Okay, so there has officially been 4 modern Planet of the Apes movies, including the newest one, which is of course Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, which I actually got to see in IMAX last weekend. And I've actually been a big fan of these movies since the start, which also means I had super high hopes for this newest installment, and I'm not gonna lie, it actually was really good. So here are my thoughts, and don't worry, if you haven't seen the movie yet, I won't be getting into spoilers, so lock in and let's talk about it.
What a wonderful day!
First things first, like I mentioned before, I did get to see this movie in IMAX, and I'm being honest when I say this was such a great looking movie. It had some super beautiful cinematic shots, and everything just looked amazing. And I'm pretty sure this is the most colorful movie out of the series, and I absolutely loved it. So if you haven't seen it yet, and you plan to, definitely try your best to see this in IMAX. It will make your viewing experience 10 times better, and everything will just pop a lot more. Okay, so of course, visuals looked amazing, and even though that can shape a movie to be a great movie, that isn't the only factor. So moving on from visuals, I want to quickly talk about Proximus Caesar, which is the main villain of this movie. And for some quick context, this movie takes place many generations after the events of the last Apes movie. So Caesar and everyone we remember from that era is literally gone, which is really sad to think about, but I guess we had to move on from those characters at some point. Anyways, before actually seeing the movie and learning what the villain's name was, I was very confused. The name just sounded really random and weird, and it was even more wild because he had Caesar in his name, which obviously Caesar was a good guy and he's a villain. It just didn't make sense. Thankfully, this all gets patched up in the movie and it makes sense once you watch it. But looking from the outside perspective, it was really strange at first. Aside from his name though, Proximus was actually a really good villain for the story they were trying to tell here. He wasn't anything mind-blowing and was miles away from being one of the best Apes villains. That role goes to Koba, and you can't challenge me on that. But he was still very intimidating when he was on screen, and he did his job of being a challenge to Noah very well. Speaking of Noah, which is the protagonist of this movie, I'm actually a big fan of his character. And like I mentioned previously, this was definitely a more colorful movie out of the rest, and Noah actually being a younger ape in this movie actually made it a bit more lighthearted, but at the same time it was a really high stakes movie, and there were a lot of dangerous scenes that actually felt dangerous. It's really hard to explain if you haven't seen the movie, but it was a nice mix. Either way, I am incredibly excited to see where they go with Noah's character, and what would be really cool is to see him become more of a gritty person throughout the next few movies. Also, in these types of movies, from Planet of the Apes to Godzilla to Kong, I've personally never been a big fan of these stories constantly making the focus of these movies the humans and everything they're going through. Sometimes I really just want to see these creatures battle it out with no human intervention at all. And even though this movie did have that concept of the people being a slight focus of the story, it definitely wasn't as bad as it could have been. Like I mentioned, this movie takes place very far in the future, which means that humans are almost extinct in this new world. But that also means when there is a person on screen, it holds way more weight and is much more powerful than it would have been, which makes it level out, and it was actually a really nice way of storytelling. Overall, I really enjoyed this movie. The only negative thing that I experienced was the 2-hour and 25-minute runtime. It did feel slightly long at some parts, but I really had to remember that this is a world-building movie. They had to build these characters up, introduce us to these characters and the world, and in that case, they did that really well. So if you do go to see this, have the mindset that they're going to be world-building for most of it. It's definitely not a bad thing. You just have to have the mindset and be ready for it, that's all. Let me know what your thoughts on it are if you have seen it, and if you haven't, let me know if you plan to go see it.
Let me tell you a little story about this girl I love too much. Man, the moral of the story is you cannot love too much. Oh baby, I gotta